Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz. Economic growth, or an increase in the production of goods and services in an economy, has long been a core aim of mainstream economics and politicians alike. This is emphasised by the OECD, describing economic growth as the most powerful instrument for reducing poverty and improving the quality of life, adding growth can generate virtuous circles of prosperity and opportunity. In a recent speech by New Zealand's Finance Minister Nicola Willis to the Auckland Business Chamber had the title "Growth is the Answer." In the speech, Willis said, "Bending New Zealand's real growth trajectory upward is the most powerful thing our government can do to drive greater incomes, revenue, choices and opportunities for our country next year and every year after that." However, not everyone believes targeting economic growth is the best way forward, with an increasingly vocal degrowth movement or network speaking out. So just what is degrowth, and what might a post-growth economy look like and mean? To discuss this, I'm joined by Jennifer Wilkins. Jennifer's a researcher and advocate on sustainability in business with a focus on degrowth at a practice founded by her called Heliocene. Hi, Jennifer, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So look, to start with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you do, and how you've ended up as an advocate for degrowth?
So my role really is to help enterprise prepare for a post-growth economy. And the way I do that is I do research, which is a mix of academic research and sort of business-focused research, which is more about white papers, which is a little bit less rigorous, and I can get ideas out a little faster using that kind of medium. And the way I came to degrowth was I used to work in a more of a corporate environment. I've worked in several industries, including motor manufacturing, forestry, construction. I've worked in accounting, IT, and business to government commerce. And in those roles, I gravitated naturally towards sustainability and eventually impact. And I realized that they weren't contributing enough to our global goals on social and environmental issues. And there needed to be a more systemic approach. So degrowth leapt out at me as being the answer to that. I then built up my credentials in that space. I've completed a master's in degrowth at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, which focused on sort of ecological economics and policy and economics. And a lot of my work is EU-facing, Europe-facing, because they're very much ahead on this. But my master's itself, my thesis, looked at Maori economy. So I'm trying to bring those ideas into New Zealand.
And I noticed on your website you've done a few video presentations, webinar type things, and you've talked to investment banks in the US and those types of people too. So there's a sort of growing audience in this area.
There's a lot of curiosity. I think some of those bodies and institutions that I've spoken to have been curious about it rather than wanting to know how to apply it. But I think that's changing, and I think that there are more people who are interested in how they get the first foot into degrowth and what it might mean for them.
Yeah, I guess we'll start at the beginning then. I mean, what is degrowth?
Well, degrowth is normally described or defined as sort of an equitable downscaling of production and consumption. Other people add in other parts of that definition, which is about reorganising the market for a new role for the market in provisioning. So I think about degrowth as being a transition. So starting from the economy that we have now, which is very much about trickle-down wealth and extracting from nature, to a future economy which is more about universal well-being in an economy within ecology and nature. And degrowth is really the transition from one to the other. So I don't think about it as being a very rapid change or a very smooth change. I think about it as being a hybrid of emergent and receding ideas, quite a lot of tension and a lot of mutation in the economy. So it's quite a complex thing, degrowth.
Yeah. And where did is it right to call it a degrowth movement or a degrowth network of like-minded people around the world? Where did this come from? I mean, what's the origins of it?
It's both a movement and a field of research. The origins of it are, I think we can look back to the 1970s, and we can look at the work of a Romanian mathematician called Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who basically is the father of ecological economics. He called it bioeconomics. And he looked at how the economy was affected by the laws of physics, like the law of entropy, for instance, which basically says that everything in the universe is tending toward chaos. And when you bring that down to sort of tangible level for us in the economy, it just means that the resources and energy that we use they degrade over time, which is something that limits circular economy, for instance. It also has roots in limits to growth, which was, as everybody knows, a simulation of how population, production, and nature interact, which predicted that business as usual would result in a pollution-induced crash of production and population within about 100 years. So we're looking at sort of 2040, 2050 there. And my friend Guy Harrington, who I know you've interviewed in the past, redid that whole simulation and came up with using real data in the intervening period and reconfirmed those models. So that's also one of the origins. And then the actual word degrowth kind of comes from an anti-consumerist movement in France, which around about the year 2000 was trying to provoke people to understand the links between consumerism and environmental degradation. So they started using décroissance, as they say, or degrowth as a missile word, as a provocation.
Okay. So I guess I'm interested in based on what you're saying, I guess the reason why you'd say that degrowth is needed is because of overconsumption and damage to the planet, to the environment, those types of issues. Mm-hmm. So, how is it achieved, or how could it be achieved?
Well, when you think about what the pressures are, we've exceeded planetary boundaries by quite a long way on several of them. So we do need to reduce our use of resources and energy significantly, urgently, and sufficiently, actually, to bring us below those planetary boundaries. Some models so far have shown us that we can operate humanity within planetary boundaries using existing technologies, but we do need to get rid of wastage and surplus in the system. We do need to redistribute in order to achieve universal well-being, and that is what degrowth is about. It's about operating within planetary boundaries, but providing a decent living for everyone. And that is more of a political challenge than a technological challenge, because it's about redesigning our whole systems around provisioning.
When you talk about planetary boundaries, what specifically are you referring to?
Well, the Stockholm Research Centre created a sort of a scientific mapping, if you like, about the safe limits of Earth system perturbation, if you like, by human activity. And they discovered that some of the things that we were doing as a global society were creating environmental issues that were making it unsafe for humanity. So we have climate change, we have freshwater loss, we have ocean acidification, we have land use change, which is affecting biodiversity and things like that. So we need to move away from those extreme levels of agitation of the Earth system and get ourselves back into alignment with nature's tolerances and ability to regenerate.
Obviously, we've got a push to net zero going on in New Zealand and in other countries, and a move to, I guess, move on or move past fossil fuels. So there's obviously the talk about green growth, that type of thing, technological advancements that are going on and maybe talked about as possibilities in the future. Is all of that not enough?
No, it's not enough. And the evidence is showing that it's not enough. It's necessary. I agree with it happening, but it is not enough. When you think about business in general and its business sustainability journey, it has started with the low-hanging fruits of efficiencies, resource efficiencies, water, energy, and things like that. And that got us part of the way where we needed to be. But I think business realized that it wasn't contributing enough, even with resource efficiencies, to some of our greater goals. So it started looking at impact, started looking at absolute decoupling, which is the idea of growing with reducing your impact as well. And that's where the shift to renewables comes in, for instance. We talked about planetary boundaries before. If absolute decoupling doesn't reach us to within planetary boundaries, then that's not enough. And that's where degrowth gives us that extra oomph and enables us to change our business systems to operate within planetary boundaries while delivering well-being.
Okay, so you talked a lot about business and business systems. What does degrowth mean, I guess, at an individual level, at a business level, and for communities as well? What would it actually mean for those three groups?
Yeah, what it would look like.
Yeah.
Well, I think for individuals, you would see some changes in terms of your participation in democracy. There would be, ideally, there'd be more citizens' assemblies. There would be more worker involvement in governance, in community and business. There'd be more interaction with your community in terms of sharing assets, such as different libraries for different things, clothes, tools, etc. Shared services such as community gardens, community kitchens, community composting, community cars, and things like that. There would be more contribution to your community as well. You'd be able to contribute your skills and time, and get time banking would be something that might happen. There'd be changes in the world of work for individuals. There could be more job sharing, shorter hours, and job rotation. You might find yourself being the recipient of a universal basic income. You'd also perhaps experience more public services. There'd be a ramp up in, say, for instance, public transport, and perhaps even things like food and energy at more affordable prices for everyone. In terms of communities, I think that they will become more collaborative and more productive. And we're going to see things like community projects around housing and energy and reducing pollution. We might even see things like community currencies and community banking and credit unions, and an expansion of the commons, which communities will take on board a responsibility to look after the commons. In terms of business, it's a never-ending list of things that might affect business. The big ones being there's a new generation of business models, coming through. The idea of a not-for-profit corporate structure is a new idea. We'd see new metrics for success based around well-being and resource efficiencies as a ratio, and new forms of value creation, new forms of performance, alternative ownership structures for enterprises such as worker cooperatives and stewardship ownership, a separation between ownership rights and voting rights, for instance, as well. More regulations around obsolescence and marketing to reduce both of those, and perhaps more financial innovations to give businesses opportunities to engage in projects without having to grow in order to pay back, big interest or big equity returns. On the board, you're going to see workers, as I said before, but also more representation from nature. The rights of nature will come into the boardroom, and future generations, obviously, we discount a lot into the future. Should we be doing that at all? It's a big question. Changes in your product portfolio toward products which are more based on use value rather than exchange value. Recognizing absolute externally set limits for your ecological performance rather than the incrementalism that we see now. And just generally things like that we can expect will be new standards, new data flows, new reporting frameworks, and things like that.
It's a much more of a collective than individual approach that you're outlining there. What's degrowth's relationship like with capitalism? I mean, do degrowthers see a future for capitalism? Is this a different type of capitalism? Is it a completely different system? How do you see it?
I don't think the answer is there yet with regard to capitalism. Businesses will need capital, so we will still need to move capital around. Capitalism currently is a very extractive system. It basically takes value out of businesses and redistributes that to business owners. If there is a way to move capital around that is less extractive, if we can adapt some of the elements of capitalism, then that would be helpful. And I mentioned before things like splitting ownership and voting rights in business as well, which will help us make different decisions with our capital. Where will pension funds fit into that? Pension funds ideally should be looking at new forms of value for their future generations, whereas their current clients are really looking for, cash. Future generations might be looking for something different, a different type of value. And the role of asset managers is very strong at the moment. The likes of BlackRock and Vanguard, and what are they going to do when they're faced with a no-growth future? What decisions are they going to make? And market economies, we associate them with capitalism, but market economies have been around for thousands of years, and capitalism is something that's quite new. So we can have markets without capitalism. So, the jury's out on the role of capitalism.
And what would degrowth mean for specific industries? And a couple of examples I've thought of here is manufacturing is one, because you're obviously talking about reduced consumption. And then also, what about agriculture, which is obviously a key industry in New Zealand and we all need to eat, and also tourism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are the biggies, I think, for New Zealand. Manufacturing will be affected by a lot of the things that I've just said before when we were talking about how degrowth would impact business. They'd see a lot of that. I think for manufacturing in particular, thinking about sort of factories, plant size would probably reduce and localise because volumes would be reducing for some goods, not all goods, but some goods. So we'd see a lot more job sharing, we'd see shorter factory hours, and reduced volumes might change the types of technologies that businesses are willing or able to invest in as well, so more low technologies. And I think product redesign will be really important as we're reducing obsolescence and improving durability and repairability of what they produce. In terms of agriculture, obviously as we move away from fossil fuels, there will be limits to the amount of synthetic fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides that we'll see in the system. So farming is going to have to look to alternative methods for those kinds of functionalities. So things like closed loop farming and indigenous species and agroecology. And we're also going to see a difference in the way that business or the market plays a role in provisioning. So there's going to be more linkages between businesses and communities and households and the state, because the ultimate aim will be to provision well-being with the lowest sort of resource cost. And if the market can't do that, then they need to step aside or support other parts of provisioning to do that. So they'll play a more collaborative role. And food sovereignty is obviously a big one that people are looking for. So agriculture will have to play a role in that. Tourism, for New Zealand, of course, we're a difficult country to reach. It's going to be expensive to get here with true pricing of environmental impacts of flights and cruises and things like that. So we'll find people who will come here as a big event. They'll want to stay for longer, but they'll also want to have a low footprint while they're here. They'll be looking for public transport options. They'll be looking for cycling options. they'll be looking for non-capitalist accommodation. They'll be looking perhaps even for journeying on waterways and things like that. And more slow tourism, more localised and more cultural.
So Jennifer, in terms of government fiscal policy and monetary policy, which we have run by central banks these days, what's the degrowth movements and degrowth advocates thinking on how fiscal and monetary policy should be run and what the purposes are of it?
The purposes of monetary and fiscal policy will be to restore our ecologies and to reduce inequality. So those are the two outcomes that we're looking for. In terms of fiscal policy, we'd be looking to redirect subsidies away from sunset industries and harmful industries and redirect it toward community outcomes, supporting things like local currencies, community banking, and building community wealth through things like land trusts and community investment funds. We'd also be looking at taxation, which taxes things like pollution and extraction and capital gains and wealth. And we're looking at things like maximum income ratios, so that the highest paid person in an organisation wouldn't be paid 100 times more than the average worker. They'd be paid perhaps 5 or 6 times more. So sort of capping incomes and reducing or deregulating, discouraging financial speculation. So housing, for instance, would not be viewed as an asset, but as a right. And in terms of, monetary policy, we have some very blunt instruments at the moment. So we'd be looking for more precision in terms of monetary policy. We'd think of money as a public good. I think the central bank is already looking at a digital currency. So a sovereign digital currency would take a lot of power away from retail banks, and that would be a good thing for a lot of people. We'd have special purpose money as well, so we could tag money to regions, for instance, and make digital money a local currency in some way. We would want to eventually drop GDP as our key macroeconomic metric and look at more diverse metrics, more of a dashboard type of metric, things like the genuine progress indicator or the human development index, something like that. We'd also want to use interest rates in a different way. They're used currently at the moment to cool the economy or to stimulate the economy. But what we'd want them to do is actually to redistribute resources and to encourage investment in certain parts of the economy and move it away from other parts of the economy. So that's what I'm talking about, the precision of that policy. By localising our economies, we would be able to control inflation a little better as well, by taking out that sort of international factor of disruptions in global logistics and overseas war and corporate greed around the world as well, which really impacts us here too. We'd also want in a degrowth or post-growth economy to have full employment. And the reason for that is obviously it gives people means, but it also eradicates that sort of worker capitalist or business owner relationship. Capitalism really relies on there being a pool of unemployed people, which we'd want to move away from that and have full employment. And then there's other ideas which are emerging in degrowth, which are to do with modern monetary theory and which is not a degrowth theory, but how those theories of degrowth and theories of modern monetary could be combined to create a way of using sovereign money to fund some of the things that we want to do in our society, but doing so within planetary boundaries. So those are the sorts of monetary and fiscal changes that we might see.
Is there a deadline by when degrowth proponents such as yourself believe that these changes need to happen? I mean, you noted I think the limits to growth timeline was 2040, 2050. Are you aligned with that? And also, I mean, what if this doesn't happen? What if the current sort of growth focused path continues?
I mean, the deadline's hard to predict. We are definitely moving into greater chaos year by year, and that we've exceeded 1.5 degrees now as well. And we're seeing much more extreme weather events. I tend in my work not to focus too much on those deadlines. I try and look at how we make the change happen, but the sense of urgency is always there. Growth is a gamble, basically. We're gambling on a speculative technological future to reverse a lot of the damage, not just in the past, but the damage that we intend to, create in the future as well. And that's a huge demand on technological change. And so I don't think we can afford that gamble. And we at least need to start creating the optionality for degrowth right now. So I think the urgency is right now.
I'm interested in, I guess, the sort of living standards and expectations that people have, and then I guess how does a politician sell these ideas to the public? I mean, for example, would degrowth does it require people to accept a lower standard of living, or for politicians to run for office advocating a lower standard of living for the public? Or is lower not the word? Would you say different rather than lower? I mean, I guess it all depends on how you measure a standard of living, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think degrowth is definitely looking to raise standards of living for the majority of people around the world. I think standards of living are actually decreasing at the moment. I think around the world, middle class lifestyles are decreasing in quality. And so there's this myth, if you like, that raising growth improves well-being. But the evidence shows that there's actually a bliss point. Economic growth improves well-being up to a certain GDP per capita, and beyond that, it either doesn't make a difference and or eventually it begins to reduce well-being. So the bliss point is actually quite a lot lower than New Zealand's GDP per capita. So we have theoretically enough wealth already. We just need to redistribute it. I think people who are very well off will not see a reduction in their well-being or their living standards through a redistribution. But I think people who are less well off will see a great improvement in their well-being through a redistribution. So, degrowth in that respect is actually extremely well-being focused. And I think that politicians who want to run on a degrowth platform have a lot of positive things that they can say. And it's about redefining what we see as value. I mean, at the moment, we think about wealth as value and prosperity, but prosperity is really about things like having more leisure time, having, a healthier natural environment around us, having more community health and more community cohesion, having more access to services and assets, and having an increase in our democratic participation. And those are all things that degrowth wishes to grow.
So it is looking, though, for I guess, the wealthy top of society to give up, some of what they have, or possibly a lot of what they have. I'm sure most of them will be reluctant to do that. So I guess, how does degrowth ever become, I guess, a core public policy or something that a political party could actually run with and really have a chance of changing things? I guess I'm thinking here, dramatic major change as being advocated here is really hard to achieve unless there's a really clear, visible emergency. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you're outlining, humans living beyond our means and planetary, breakdowns, etc., all these things. And we can see around the world today that there are problems. But to a lot of people, their thinking will be, oh, that doesn't affect me, or that's not as bad as people say it is, or I'm doing okay. So I guess the question here is, will degrowth become a core public policy? Will governments and communities really target this instead of growth? And how do you sell it? Mm-hmm. Because it's a complicated, complex concept, as you've said.
I think it will become public policy. I think parties will run on it as a platform. It's hard to say when that would happen, but I think in the not too distant future. And I think the thing is that growth as an idea is so embedded as a common sense that it never has to explain itself. And so there's a bit of an unfair playing field in terms of degrowth will have to explain itself to become credible, whereas growth gets a free pass. But I think that as we go on, the growth policies, and Nicola Willis, as you alluded at the beginning, is growth. Growth is not producing the effects that we have experienced in the past, like the raising of the standards of the middle class, the living standards of the middle class. That ship has sailed. We're in a different world now. There isn't room for growth to create those kinds of benefits anymore. We need to create benefits in a different way. So growth will fail to evidence itself as a well-being, a process for well-being in future. And there'll be a confluence of factors. There'll be, this failure of neoliberalism, which I think we're already experiencing. There's going to be a lack of growth in rich nations, as we've already seen happening in Japan, increasing climate chaos, as you said. But also, we're going to see more advances in the field of degrowth. There's going to be a lot more argumentation from degrowth academics into the policy sphere to give that evidence to policymakers and to create manifestos for political parties. So there's a lot of research happening in Europe at the moment. They're freeing up a lot of resources for degrowth research, which I think a lot of people will find surprising. But I'm talking tens of millions of dollars into degrowth research right now. And they're looking at things like, what is it that we are assuming about growth that creates human flourishing? And is there actually the evidence to support that? So there's that critique side. But there's also, how do we create welfare within planetary boundaries? What are the models that integrate different policies and how, when you pull one lever, what happens to the other factors? What are the macroeconomic indicators that we need to support, whether a policy is working or failing? How do we see that? Post-growth climate scenarios are being developed right now. We'll see those in future IPCC reports. And then there's also the redesign of provisioning around, at the moment we think about provisioning as the market and the state, but it's going to be for providers in future. It's going to be market, state, communities and households. And how do we get financial innovations and policy innovations to support that sort of multifold provisioning system?
Well, look, that's an interesting discussion. Thanks so much, Jennifer. That's Jennifer Wilkins, researcher and advocate on sustainability in business with a focus on degrowth at her practice called Pliocene. And I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.